Hey there, and welcome back to Badass Branding. We are now in Module 3, where we're going to talk about brand identity. And in this first lesson, we're going to talk about the what and the why of brand identity. So we start off with a truth bomb, and that is that you are not Nike or Apple, at least not yet. A cool or clever logo isn't going to make or break your business, especially when you're starting out. So as we go through this course, we're focusing on fundamentals and we're focusing on keeping it simple. You can get fancy later. So in this lesson, we are going to learn what brand identity is and how it fits into your branding process. We're going to understand why brand identity is important, and we're going to go over the core components of brand identity. And as we go through the rest of this module, we'll dive in deeper to those individual parts. So let's recap here. So branding is the process of creating a strong, consistent, positive perception of your business over time in the mind of your customer. And so if branding is that gut feeling that your audience has about you and your business, so what is brand identity then? Well, brand identity is essentially a collection of visual elements that help define who you are, and it communicates value and personality to your audience. So for instance, brand identity is essentially that visual representation of your business. And it's the toolkit that we use to articulate what we did in the brand strategy part of the brand roadmap. And your brand identity it's the unique fingerprint. It's that visual thing that is unique from everybody else, and it sets you apart in a lot of ways. As we go through these building your brand, not all brands are actually created equally. And what I mean by that is there are essentially different levels of brand identity, and they're basically three: fundamental, intermediate, and top tier. Now in the fundamental, it's just what that is. It's very foundational. It's typically more basic, and it has a low barrier to entry, meaning it doesn't cost a lot of money. It's easy to build upon over time, which is why I stress getting the fundamentals right. And it's typically a DIY situation. You're doing it yourself. You have low budgets, and you tend to do all that stuff yourself. As your business gains traction, you can move into the intermediate, which is where you're more established. Your brand identity can become a little more complex, and you will probably have some investment, meaning you'll probably hire out some parts of it or all of it, depending on what your budgets are. And it's a little bit more finely tuned because over time we get to understand who our audiences are on a deeper level, and the brand identity at that point can really talk to them on a deeper level. And this is usually a combination of DIY and outsourced. And DIY is do-it-yourself. And then we have the top tier brands. These are your juggernauts, your Targets, your Nikes, your Apples. Now, these can be simple or complex, but it doesn't mean that they're not effective. And these are typically going to be a higher level of investment. And these are going to be your thought leaders, your trendsetters, and they will typically work with branding agencies or at least a high-level graphic designer or a brand designer. So let's look at a brand identity in action. So what I did was I just went onto Google, I searched Target, brand or something like that, and these are the first two rows that came up in Google. And as you can see now, all the colors are exactly the same. All the fonts are the same. All the visual style is the same. And so over time, and obviously in their case, lots of money and investment, you come to know where there's only one place on this entire screenshot that the name Target actually appears, but you can see that it's just the logo in most cases without the name. And that's what branding does over time. And then if we look at our very own Bobby Klink, you look at his brand identity, and obviously the slide deck is his, and it's all cohesive. It all looks the same. His website looks the same as his podcast artwork. That looks the same as this slide deck and anything else that you come into contact with as it relates to his business. And then even if you look at mine, my website looks the same as my video show artwork. I have the brand photos. All my PDFs will have that same look and feel, same color, same fonts all throughout. So then why is brand identity important? Well, brand identity is basically the vehicle that we use to visually represent that strategy we did in the discovery phase of the brand roadmap. And there are a few things that it can, are a few reasons why brand identity is important. And one of those, the first reason is that it's going to give you a higher perceived value, especially when it's done well. And what this does, it builds credibility over time. It allows you to charge premium fees because you're seen as more professional and more premium. And over time, it will build loyalty. It also can give you brand recognition. And what this does, it kind of trains your audience on what to expect from you over time. So if you're consistent with your visuals, if you're consistent in how you show up and how often you show up, it'll give you that brand recognition over time. And your audience will remember you over time. And just a reminder, and I say this over and over again, but your brand has to be experienced 5 to 7 times at a minimum before your audience starts to remember. So this is why your brand identity is so important, because it gives you that toolkit to be consistent over time. Next, your brand identity will allow you to differentiate yourself from your competitors from a visual standpoint, right? So obviously you're going to differentiate yourself in your products and your services and your offers and your personality and all that. But that visual part is also another facet of differentiation that will allow you to separate yourself from your competitors. And it also articulates your brand personality and your core values and all of those things. And then lastly, it builds trust. Like I said before, consistency over time will build trust. That means people can rely upon you. People will know what to expect over time, and people will be more likely to buy from you if they can trust you and see you as a trusted source. So what are the core components of brand identity? So if we go back to the branding roadmap, we're in that develop phase. And you can see now we're moving along from the foundational to the transformational. We're getting closer to that transformational. And this is where we develop the brand identity. And again, let's look at the develop phase in a little bit more detail. So let's just a reminder that your brand identity is that visual toolbox that articulates what you did in that discover or strategy phase. And these are the core components of the develop phase or your brand identity. And these are going to be your color palette, your fonts, logos, patterns, textures, design elements, your photography, whether it's going to be brand photography or product photography, and then, of course, your brand guidelines. So let's look at these in individual silos here. So your colors and fonts. These can influence emotions and behavior because, we all are emotional beings. We are visual beings. In fact, we process visuals like 60,000 times faster than we do text. So your colors and your fonts are going to be a core component of that visual. Your colors and fonts can also establish a tone. So whether it's excitement, whimsical, minimalist, edgy, etc., that tone can be established just with colors and fonts alone. And again, your colors and fonts can help represent your personality and your values. Next up, we have your logo. Your logo is your brand identifier, and it should be consistent wherever you use it, whether that's your website, your slide decks, PDFs, social media, business cards, stationery, whatever you put out there that's going to be public facing should be consistent wherever you use it. And when you create your logo, you should have, at the very least, a black and a white version. And if you do incorporate color, you should have a color version. So those are the 3 versions you should have for your logo. And again, remember, this does not need to be fancy or super clever because, again, if you're here, we're just starting out. We're building our personal brands. And if we focus too much on that logo, we're not focusing on what really needs to be done in our business to move it forward. Next up, we have patterns and textures. You don't have to have these in a brand identity, but what they do, they add depth to your visual. So looking at this slide deck as an example, the background here is a really rough sort of cement, stucco wall texture. And then you have these little elements of rough brush strokes that kind of give that rough, grungy texture to it. And what this does, it can just further articulate that brand personality. And frankly, it just adds a visual interest to keep your audience's attention. But the visual interest that we're adding is strategic, not just for decoration's sake. And then we have design elements. These are going to be aside from your textures and shapes are going to be like icons, shapes, or lines used to create the designs that add another layer to your visual brand. And even things like how your pages are laid out, whether it's the spacing or how the different sections are differentiated or how things are ordered, that's all part of the design elements. That's a little bit more on the hierarchy side. But then you can also incorporate little accoutrements that accent your brand designs and web pages. So they could be just like little spattering of things, like in the case of this slide deck, you see these little rough brush strokes, and those add those sort of little accoutrements that add more personality. And then next up we have photography. This is basically another way to add connection to your visuals. And oftentimes brand photography especially are more than just headshots. These are going to more connect with your audience because they see who you are in a personal brand, and then they can connect with you because they might connect with what it is that you're doing in the photo or what your personality is and those kinds of things, right? And your brand photography can help tell stories, not in a once upon a time kind of way, but just sort of like showing you using your product or showing you living out your brand values, right? So those are the things that your photography can help with. And then you have things like recurring theme photos, whether they're, conceptual photos or photos of you, but those recurring theme photos with a consistent visual style. So your photos should have the same visual style. So maybe you use all black and white, or maybe you have like a vivid color filter applied to them, or maybe these photos are edgier or they're softer. So those are the things that you have to think about when we look at photography. And again, we'll dive into that further when we do the photography lesson. And then lastly is the brand guidelines. This is the culmination of all of these things. It's an internal document that compiles all the elements of your brand identity and basically shows you how to use them. So the purpose of having this is that it ensures that consistency across all your visual communication in your brand and your business, no matter who's working on it. So you can have your VA or a designer or a web developer. So no matter who is working on your brand, you give them this brand guidelines, and everything that's produced is going to have that same consistent look and feel. And that is the purpose of the brand guidelines. So now I want you to take action. So now that you understand sort of what goes into creating your brand identity and all the core components, I want you to research some businesses and brands that you use and follow online, and look at their brand identity and how it's showing up. Check out their feeds, whether it's Instagram or Facebook. Are they doing live shows, or are they doing just a blog post? And what does their website look like? What does their social media look like? And kind of get an idea of how all this stuff is showing up, and does it articulate their brand personality or their values and those kinds of things. So go ahead and research a handful of businesses or brands or influencers that you might follow, and that will really help you sort of guide you as you start to build your own. So when your brand identity is aligned with your brand strategy, it can be very powerful and connect with your audience more effectively. So that's it for this lesson. Just to give you a recap, we went over what brand identity is and how it fits into your business. We went over why brand identity is important, and we just went over briefly the core components of brand identity. So in the next lesson, we are going to go over now in detail how to nail your brand colors. I'll see you in the next lesson.